All right, first, describe inheritance in humans for autosomal and X-linked inheritance or traits. So before we discuss the difference between autosomal and X-linked traits, let's talk about what a trait even is and define a few other key terms. So genetic traits are characteristics that are encoded in our DNA. So anything from hair color, eye color, height, those sort of physical characteristics are all traits. And then next is allele. And an allele is a section of a chromosome containing the DNA for a particular trait. And remember, we have 2 copies of each chromosome. And so you have 1 allele on each chromosome. Those 2 chromosomes are the same, except you got 1 from one parent and 1 from the other parent. So you got 1 allele from your mother and 1 allele from your father. And then next is genotype versus phenotype. So genotype is the letters or bases of DNA that you have on your chromosome corresponding to a gene. And phenotype is the physical characteristic that results from that genotype. And we'll go in a little more detail with these and learn about dominant and recessive and how 2 different genotypes could produce the same physical phenotype. Next is Punnett Square. So Punnett Square is a way to visualize genetic inheritance. So it's a way of writing out the alleles from each parent in a square grid. So these vertical letters here correspond to an allele from one parent, and then these horizontal correspond to the allele from the other parent. And then you write them out in these squares to show what the chances are of offspring inheriting each genotype. And so, let's see, the last definition, X and Y chromosomes. So these are the unique chromosomes of, in humans, of the 23 pairs of chromosomes we have, 22 pairs are autosomal, and 1 pair is the sex chromosomes. So the sex chromosomes are essentially what determines biological sex. So if you have an X and a Y chromosome, then you're biologically male. And if you have an X and an X chromosome, you're biologically female. Of course, it's always a little more complicated than an introductory course can cover, and you can get into a lot more details than this, but that's the scope of this course. Yeah, so then the last thing I wanted to touch on was just inheritance and what we're referring to when we say inheritance in this instance. So inheritance in this case refers to inheriting traits controlled by a single gene with 2 alleles, one of which may be dominant to the other. So if we go back to this picture, this is a diagram showing inheritance of color in these peas. These are pea plants. So this pea plant was green and this pea plant was yellow. And when you cross those and pollinate them together, the resulting offspring pea plants can turn out as green or yellow. So inheritance is, in this case, is referring to this one trait, color, green or yellow. And for the sake of simplicity, we're referring to it as this pattern where it's one allele, this G allele, and the trait can be dominant for the big G for green and recessive for the little g for yellow. So let's get into a few more details and see if we can make this make more sense. So let's first cover autosomal inheritance. So autosomal traits are controlled by genes on one of the 22 in humans, one of the 22 autosomes. So one of the 22 chromosomes that are not the sex chromosomes. And autosomal traits are all of the chromosomes except for the X or Y chromosome. And so these do not differ between males and females. So autosomal traits are inherited in the same way, regardless of the sex of the parent or offspring. So an example of an autosomal trait we're going to look at here would be eye color. Note that eye color is not truly determined by a single gene. There's multiple genes that can control eye color in humans, but for this example, we're going to consider it as a single gene trait. So let's say a single autosomal gene with two alleles determines whether you have darker, more pigmented eyes like brown, or lighter, less pigmented eyes like blue. So having brown eyes is an autosomal dominant trait, and blue is an autosomal recessive. So see, you can see up here, mom's alleles go here. So there's a big A and a little a. Those are the two alleles that mom carried. And dad was also big A and little a. So there's his two alleles. So we put these in this Punnett square and put an A from mom and an A from dad. So two big A's right here is the genotype for this square, and this results in brown eyes. And then in the next square over, we got a big A from dad, a little a from mom. The big A is the dominant gene, or a dominant allele in this case, so still brown eyes. Same case here, there's a big A and a little a. The big A is dominant, brown eyes. And then finally, this last square, there's a little a from mom and a little a from dad, and that shows up. There's no dominant allele masking the recessive one. There's two recessive alleles, and so the resulting eye color in this case is blue. And so this is the simplest pattern of autosomal trait inheritance. And then let's talk about X-linked traits. So X-linked traits, also called sex-linked traits, are traits that are controlled by genes on the sex chromosomes, and X-linked specifically on the X chromosome. And single gene X-linked traits have a different pattern of inheritance than single gene autosomal traits. So because males have just one X chromosome and one Y, they have only one allele for any X-linked trait. So any trait that's controlled by a gene located on the X chromosome, in males, they just have one allele for that because they have one X chromosome. So any recessive allele that's X-linked is always expressed in males. So if a male ends up with a recessive allele on an X-linked trait, then he is going to be recessive for that trait always, because he doesn't have another X chromosome to provide another allele. And females have two X chromosomes, and because of that, they have two alleles for any X-linked trait. And so in order for them to show a recessive trait, they would have to inherit two copies of a recessive allele to express that recessive trait. So this explains why recessive traits are less common in females than in males. So an example of a recessive X-linked trait is red-green color blindness. And so maybe you've heard before that it's more common for males to be colorblind than it is for females. And that's because the gene that controls red-green color perception is on the X chromosome. So here's another diagram that kind of displays this. So let's say a father and a mother have offspring, and the father is unaffected by an X-linked gene, so he doesn't have that recessive allele, but the mother does have a recessive allele, so that means she's a carrier. She has one dominant allele, signified by this dark green, and one recessive allele, showed by this lighter green. And then when they have offspring together, then these are the different probabilities of genotypes and phenotypes that their children could have, given the X-linked alleles that they'll inherit from the father and the mother. So they could have an unaffected son, he inherited the dominant form of the allele, or an unaffected daughter, she also got a dominant form of the allele, or a carrier daughter, she got one dominant and one recessive, so one from her dad and one from her mom, or an affective son, he got the X chromosome from his mom that carried that recessive allele. And then here's another picture showing that, and this just emphasizing here that females, mothers, they have two X chromosomes, And fathers, they have one X and one Y. That's the little green one. So just to hammer down that males and females have a different pattern of inheritance in X-linked traits.